In this video, I want to dive straight into DBH's fourth meditation. Now, in the fourth meditation, DBH offers an extended reflection on the question of human freedom and human autonomy. The main reason, of course, that he feels he needs to address the topic of human free will is because he, being an advocate for universalism, might seem to have a problem on his hand. If God will, in the end, after all, save everyone, and if this is a guaranteed fact of reality, then what becomes of the notion of human free will? It may seem that any idea of human freedom ends up collapsing if God makes it such that everyone, no matter what they choose, will end up being saved in the end. I suppose that this is probably my favorite section of the book, mainly, I think, because I enjoy debates and discussions about human free will and the sovereignty of God, not least with respect to things like salvation. I also enjoyed this book because I think it takes us to where the heart of the matter truly is. When it comes to universalism, I think a lot of people's views about universalism typically center around the question of human free will and human autonomy with respect to God. I also think I like this section of the book because it's real straightforward, and I appreciate his candid approach to this particular question. He leaves out some things that I wish he would have discussed, but all the same, it was a fairly easy section to follow. Now, many people who reject universalism, they do so by way of the so-called free will defense. The idea is that God simply could not guarantee salvation across the board, so long as people were free in any significant sense of that word. Now, philosophers define human agency in a range of ways. Free will is defined in a range of ways for philosophers and theologians. For example, some are determinists. When it comes to human agency, some philosophers say, well, look, you're not free. You think you're free, you have the illusion that you're free, but quite frankly, that's just a myth. You're not free. Your choices are determined by forces outside of yourself. I mean, after all, you're just one person in a very big cosmos of cause and effect of physics, and your brain is just the firing of your neurons, which fire, as it turns out, due to chemistry, and chemistry obeys certain biological rules and laws, and blah, blah, blah. You are not free. The decisions you make are determined due to outside external reasons. There's no freedom under this view, essentially, right? And I should say here that I'm painting a broad brush. I'm just offering these descriptions so that you can be familiar with these debates, and you can be able to converse about this subject by using the standard description. So the first description is determinism. Okay. Sometimes philosophers define free will in a, quote, libertarian sort of way. Now, libertarians believe that human beings are free. We are genuinely free creatures. And the reason they say we are genuinely free creatures is because they define freedom as the ability to do otherwise. In other words, they think that you are free with respect to some action or some decision if you had the ability to not perform that action. So in other words, if you did not have an alternative action at your disposal, then the action you did choose, you weren't free with respect to that action. So by way of example, a simple, silly example, but it works. They would say that a libertarian would say that you are free in your decision to go to the grocery store if you if you had a genuine opportunity not to go to the grocery store. So this is known by several descriptions, but some philosophers describe this as the alternative possibilities principle. And so if you want to be free, or if you describe yourself as free, then you are only free if you have the possibility of choosing other than you did choose. I hope that makes sense. So you have determinists on the one hand, you have libertarians on the other hand. Then there are people who are called compatibilists. Now, compatibilism comes in many different shapes and forms. It's like everything in philosophy. People debate and fuss about these sorts of things. So, again, I'm painting with a broad brush. But broadly speaking, a compatibilist is someone who says that both determinism and genuine freedom are compatible, right? Hence compatibilism. And a lot of times, especially in theological circles, a compatibilist is going to define freedom simply as something like this: the ability to do what you want, or the ability to act on your greatest desire, or something like that, right? So, for example, a lot of Calvinists are going to define freedom in this sense. They're going to want to try to maintain the absolute sovereignty of God and genuine human freedom, such that a human being can be held accountable for the decisions he or she makes. Okay, so these are the three main viewpoints that are out there: determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism. Now, personally, I think there are problems with all three of these conceptions, right? I identify with libertarianism mostly, but I'm going to qualify it a little bit. Eleanor Stump has been really influential with, on me with respect to the question of freedom. So, in one of her essays that she did on Augustine, I think it was on Augustine, and I apologize, I can't remember the name of the essay, but anyway, she talks about a modified libertarian position, and to me that makes the most sense. So a modified libertarian is someone who doesn't, I mean, there are probably different conceptions of what a modified libertarian is, but the one that she puts forward, at least, goes something like this: that freedom doesn't necessarily mean you have the ability to do otherwise. So for me, I don't think that freedom entails the alternative possibilities principle. So just because you don't have the ability to do otherwise doesn't mean you're not free. But I'm not a compatibilist, right? Or a determinist. I think freedom can simply be defined as something along the lines of self-determination. So you might be in a situation where you don't have any possible choices except, say, one choice. And I think there are situations where even if you're in that situation, you're still free. Well, how is that the case? Well, suppose that you determined yourself to be put in that situation, right? And so I think that's all that freedom entails, is self-determining feature, or self-determination. So I'm a modified libertarian, okay? I don't have time to go into the reasons why I think that is the case, but I think there are really good thought experiments out there that show that it is the case. At least they're persuasive to me. So the real question, though, is where does DBH stand? What's his view? So in order to outline his view, I'll try to stick as close as I can to the arguments that he puts forward in his fourth meditation. And then along the way, I'm going to respond accordingly. So DBH makes a comment about the free will defense on page 171, and I think it's worth quoting in full. He says there that the only defense of the infernalist position that is logically and morally worthy of being either taken seriously or refuted scrupulously is the argument from free will. That hell simply exists simply because, in order for a creature to be able to love God freely, there must be some real alternative to God open to that creature's power of choice. And that hell, therefore, is a state the apostate soul has chosen for itself in perfect freedom, and that the permanency of hell is testament only to how absolute that freedom is. This argument, too, is wrong in every way, but not contemptibly so. Logically, it cannot be true, but morally, it can be held without doing irreparable harm to one's understanding of goodness or of God, and so without requiring the mind to make a secret compromise with evil, explicitly at least. Okay, so simply put, here he thinks that that the free will position is wrong, but he doesn't think it's like contemptibly wrong, right? He thinks that, okay, it's worth considering and it's worth debating and arguing against. Notice though that he does define freedom here as some sort of real alternative to God, right? You have to have the ability to choose other than God. And again, given my understanding of libertarianism, I don't always require the principle of alternative possibilities, right? I don't think you always have to have an alternative. But I should say most of the time that is the case, and most of the time that is required. I forgot to mention that a moment ago. But I don't think you always have to have it in every circumstance. The question of freedom is just a really sticky issue, right? And it can't be packaged neatly as we would like to think, at least. So anyway, nonetheless, my position is again more on that libertarian. It operates from that more libertarian framework and standpoint. So I think definitely with respect to God, at some point down the road, you're going to have an alternative to God, such that any choice for God is made meaningful. So I do think that if a person ends up going to hell, they will have to have had a choice in the matter, right? And then, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but just for the sake of clarity on my view of free will, I do think that once you have made that decision, you have no possible choices to make after that, and it's because you self-determined to be in that position, right? So hell could at least be conceived as a place where you can't get out, and you have no other choice to make other than to just continue in your sinful rebellion against God in hell for all eternity. I think that's plausible. I think it's coherent. And I think you can still be free in that situation. Why? Well, because you determined to put yourself in a situation where you would have no alternatives, right? So anyway, there's so much to be said about that, but that's just generally speaking my view, and I think it's a way to make eternal hell to be coherent. There's a lot more I want to say about hell, but not for this video. I'll allude to it at the end of this video, though, because we're going to talk about hell. What is it? I don't think hell is what most people think it is. I don't think hell's just like this. I don't think it's as simple to say that hell is this place over here, okay? At the end of time, when it's all said and done, I don't think you can say, oh, over there in that corner of the universe, that's hell, and that's where people are at, right? I don't think that's a good way to describe hell at all. So anyway, we'll talk about that down the road, a few weeks down the road. Anyway, the free will defense is my way of making sense of hell, okay? Of course, DBH states that the free will defense is not logical with respect to classical conception of God as the transcendent being that he is. But, he does nonetheless throw folks like me a bone, and at least he doesn't think that my view is contemptible, as the other views are. So I don't think my view is contemptible at all either. So he and I are in complete agreement. In fact, as DBH alludes in the passage I just quoted, the main motivation for me and others who hold to a more libertarian view of free will is that we put that forward to make sense of the reality of evil in the present world. That is, free will defenders are such largely because they want to preserve the notion of God's goodness, of God's love, of his moral superiority with respect to evil. If there is no free will for human beings, and if God is in control of every decision that a person makes, then it follows that God is the cause of evil decisions that people make. This, of course, would be problematic, because on this understanding, the so-called good God has been rendered to be, well, not good at all. So in order to preserve the idea that God is not the author or the cause of evil, philosophers and theologians sometimes like to posit the notion of creaturely freedom. And that's going to be the route that I take, in the libertarian family, that is. But alas, DBH thinks that this will not work. How come? Well, the main reason is due to how DBH defines freedom. He makes his views known on pages 172 and 173 and thereabouts. A few quotes from him are in order, I think. So let me offer a string of quotations from his book to help us get a feel of where he's coming from. So the first quote comes on page 172, and he says, quote, "Freedom is a being's power to flourish as what it naturally is, to become ever more fully what it is. The freedom of an oak seed is its uninterrupted growth into an oak tree. The freedom of a rational spirit is its consummation in union with God." Another quote on the next page, he follows Augustine when he says, quote, "The consummation of freedom for a rational creature would be to achieve not the liberty attributed by tradition to Adam and Eve, who were merely able not to sin, but rather the truest liberty of all, that of being entirely unable to sin. So again, he thinks true freedom is the ability to be unable to sin. Another quote. This comes from page 173, and I skipped to 175. He says, quote, "Rationality must by definition be intentionality, the mind's awareness, that is, of a purpose it seeks, or an end it wishes to achieve, or a meaning it wishes to affirm. Rational freedom, in its very action, must be teleological in structure. One must know the end one is choosing and why. Having no proper substance, evil cannot constitute the final cause or transcendental horizon of the natural will of any rational being. To suggest otherwise is to embrace an ultimate ontological, moral, and epistemological nihilism. It is to suggest that God himself is not the one good of all beings, the one rational end of desire. Whatever one wishes must then be what one sees as being good in some sense or another, however perversely." The last quote comes from 177. He says, "True freedom is, quote, contingent upon true knowledge and true sanity of mind. To the very degree that either of these is deficient, freedom is absent, and with freedom goes culpability." So I do think these quotes capture DBH's conception of freedom. Freedom, to sum up, is for him that uninterrupted movement toward what would make the creature flourish. In the case of human beings, and in the case of every being, freedom is nothing other than the uninterrupted movement toward God. And any movement away from God is a movement defined by irrationality and ignorance. And given that rationality and knowledge are necessary criteria for any concept of freedom, freedom is fundamentally lost when these two items are removed. And if freedom flies out the window, then so does moral culpability. Moreover, DBH states that all freedom must have some sort of end in mind. It is teleological, he says. Evil can never be that end, given its ontology. True freedom, then, is the good. True freedom is God, in other words. So in light of all this, DBH concludes on page 178, quote, "If then there is such a thing as eternal perdition as the result of an eternal refusal of repentance, it must also be the result of an eternal ignorance, and therefore has nothing really to do with freedom at all. So no, not only is an eternal free rejection of God unlikely, it is a logically vacuous idea," unquote. Now, what he means here, I think, is that even if a person believed in eternal hell for people who chose never to repent, you could not appeal to free will as a defense for that view. How come? Well, because these people are obviously choosing evil for all eternity out of their ignorance and irrationality, because all evil acts are irrational and ignorant, fundamentally, he says. And so long as they are being ignorant and irrational, they are not free in any true sense. And if they are not free, then they are not culpable. And if they are not culpable, then they cannot be punished in an eternal hell. Now, if I've accurately construed DBH's viewpoint here, and I hope that I have, and I think that I have, then I also think that there are some problems with his view. Again, I want to be very fair as I possibly can to his viewpoint, and to be honest, I like some of the things he's saying with respect to human freedom, and as God as the absolute good, etc., etc. But all the same, I wonder if he's not backing himself into a corner that he may not want to be in the end. So, for example, first, it seems to me that under a certain scenario, a person could still be seen to be morally culpable and responsible for his or her sin, even if they are acting somewhat irrationally and or ignorantly. So let me explain. While it is perhaps not true that one sinful act merits eternal punishment, let's suppose that's not true. Even if one were to grant this, it would still be true that one sinful act merits one act of punishment. You following me here? So let's further suppose that a creature chose to perform this one sinful act of rebellion against God. And then let's suppose they chose to perform that one sinful act of rebellion against God one more time. Then that act would merit an equal act of punishment. Now let us suppose further that a creature chose to do this, that is, to rebel against God with a sinful act, and they chose to do that in every subsequent present moment that they have. In other words, let's suppose they did it for eternity. then under this thought experiment, an eternal punishment would be appropriate and reasonable. I mentioned this in another video I did, and I mentioned that that even if punishment is remedial in nature, even if hell is remedial in nature, it doesn't necessarily follow that it would be salvific or temporary. It's possible, after all, that a person could choose not to go along with the remedy. I think something like that is going on here in this discussion too. The same principle applies. Now, the reason I bring all this up here is because I think DBH might have a problem with his conception of free will. It seems to me that with my thought experiment that I just gave, we can see how the problem of irrationality and ignorance is not as big of a problem as he would make it out to be, unless, of course, a person wanted to deny that all forms of punishment are unjust in the present time too. Think about it. If DBH were to deny everything I just said, and hence deny eternal punishment on the grounds that I've given, and deny that it would be unjust because such a creature is ignorant and irrational and therefore not culpable, then our entire justice system today would be rendered unjust. After all, how could we punish a criminal if in their sinful act they were doing it out of ignorance and irrationality? Why should we put people in prison who murder people? I mean, obviously murder is an irrational act, and if they're irrational, then they're not free, and if they're not free, they're not culpable, so why do we put them in prison, right? Well, we may suppose that even if all sins were ignorant and irrational, and I think they are, it doesn't follow that a person is entirely absolved of moral culpability on just those grounds. Why? Well, because it seems to me that a person could have just enough knowledge and just enough reason and sanity to choose what they are doing. No, perhaps let's suppose that they don't have perfect culpability, right? I mean, that's essentially what I'm saying. But why is perfect culpability necessary? All that is necessary is sufficient culpability, okay? So for example, a drunk driver decides to get behind the wheel. When he or she drives the car, they end up killing someone. And after being arrested, they could not say to the judge, "Hey, I was intoxicated and was therefore out of my mind." See, they couldn't use that as an excuse. And why not? Well, because they made a choice to get themselves into that irrational state of mind. Even if they could not have foreseen this happening, namely that they would end up killing somebody on their drunk driving spree, and therefore they lacked full knowledge of the situation, just because that may be true, it doesn't follow that they could not reasonably appeal to their ignorance as an excuse. They couldn't do that. And so, in their act of killing someone by their drunk driving, they nonetheless possess sufficient culpability. Complete culpability or perfect culpability is not necessary. So again, even if you decide before you decide to drink and go drive while drunk, even though you may not anticipate or be fully in the know of everything that you did, doesn't mean that you couldn't be held responsible for killing someone while you were drunk and hence in an irrational and ignorant state of mind. I mean, no, you had just enough culpability and just enough freedom to be responsible for your actions, right? Now, if that is the case, and it seems to be that it is, if that is the case with respect to the present time, so like right now, if someone were to get arrested for driving drunk and killing somebody, if all that would be true in the present time, and if that's the way we've constructed our justice system, then it's not unreasonable to suggest that it could also be the case in every subsequent present time. That is, it could be the case for all eternity. Suppose a person, even if they're acting a bit irrationally and ignorantly, suppose a person has just enough sufficient freedom such that they can be punished in hell for all eternity. Why? Because, well, they're in every moment they're choosing to rebel against God, right? And yeah, so I think something like that works. And to me, the problem is not so much what DBH is saying, but rather it's what he's not saying. It seems to me that he does not leave room for a discussion on how freedom seems to require self-determination of the will of some sort, right? I think one could agree with the fact that all sin is in some sense irrational and ignorant, and all the while hold to the idea that freedom is what it is due to the principle of self-determination. So one might say that a creature could still be free even when they determine for themselves to remain in their ignorance or to remain in their irrationality, or even get themselves into, as I said in my example with the drunk driver, to get themselves into a state of irrationality, right? So, I mean, that's what happens today, right? With the drunk driving example especially. But here's my overall point. I fear that DBH's conception of creaturely freedom would entail the opposite of what he wants. Namely, it would entail that people could never be culpable for their sins in the present time, never mind in eternity, but also right now. I think that's going to be a big issue here, because if he wants to say a person can't be held eternally responsible on the grounds that they lack knowledge and they lack rationality or something, then it seems to me like he's going to have problems justifying a justice system in the present day, especially when you construe hell the way that I have, namely that hell is locked from the inside, as C.S. Lewis said, and hell is just an ongoing willful rebellion against God. All eternity is a succession of moments, right? And suppose in each moment that person is rebelling against God. Well, if in that moment they're rebelling against God, then that merits a moment of punishment. And in the next moment, if they're rebelling against God, that warrants a moment of punishment back. And suppose that goes on for eternity. If that can go on in the present moment now, in the present time, someone commits an act of evil out of ignorance or irrationality, and we give them the appropriate punishment with respect to that criminal act that they've performed. If that's okay to do, then it's okay to do that again if they commit the same crime later on in life, even if there's an element of irrationality and ignorance to their crime. Okay, so I hope all that makes sense. I think that's a way to justify the idea of hell, and I think it exposes a little hole in DBH's discussion about culpability and freedom and whatnot. Okay. All right, I want to move on, though, to a few other items. DBH accepts, to some extent, the label determinism when he describes his definition of freedom. You can find this on page 178 and 179. Now, he says his view is a, quote, kind of determinism. Now, surely for me, this is very problematic. I don't like that. I don't like that concept of determinism. So again, the basic idea of determinism is that a person's actions, your actions, my actions, your grandma's actions, they are what they are due to some decision made by someone or something else, or someone or something outside of themselves. Now, contrary to this, I think freedom entails something along the lines of self-determination. I just don't think there's any way you can hold anybody responsible for anything they do if they did not determine that action for themselves in some way or some shape, right? Now, what's interesting here is that DBH takes issue, he explicitly names two philosophers that he takes issue with, namely Eleanor Stump and Alvin Plantinga. Now, arguably, these two philosophers are some of the best minds in the Christian tradition of our time. And at any rate, he takes issue with them when they say things like, it doesn't lie in God's power to assure that all will be saved. Now, this is his words, but he says that when they say things like that, there's some problems. So let me give that quote. He says, when they say things like, quote, it does not lie in God's power to assure that all will be saved, for the salvation of each person is contingent on his or her free choice, and God cannot compel a free act and yet preserve it in its freedom. That's on page 182. So he takes particular issue with Eleanor Stump in one of her articles that she wrote a few decades ago, and this is what she had to say according to him. I didn't go back and look up this quote. I'm just taking him at his word that he quoted her accurately. But anyway, this is what she says, quote, it is not within the power of even an omnipotent entity to make a person freely will anything. Now, I agree with Stump here. That's a contradiction. If someone makes someone to freely choose something, that's nonsense. It makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. Now, you can make someone do something, but once they do it, because you made them, then they're not free, right? So I think Stump is absolutely correct. Now, his issue with our statement, though, is that the words omnipotent entity, they don't make sense to him. He thinks the problem is that Stump views God as an entity. God, he says, is not an entity. And because of this, DBH argues, quote, that neither is he some sort of particular object that one could choose or reject in the same way that one might elect either to drink a glass of wine or to pour it out into the dust. So he wants to get away from this idea that God is just one entity among other entities, right? He wants to say, no, God, in accordance with classical Christian theism, is the all-encompassing transcendent being of all entities, right? I mean, he's more primal than just to say he's just some object that we can choose or not choose, right, or whatever. But what's interesting here is he never really refutes Eleanor Stump's claim that if you have someone who makes someone else do something, then you can't say that's a free act. He never really refutes that. In fact, if I remember right, he says, yeah, that's basically true. But he just takes exception with how she frames the question, right? So anyway, that aside, here's the thing. Here's my problem. When he says that God is not a, quote, particular object that one could choose or reject in the same way that people choose or reject a glass of wine, my response here, when I first read that, and I've read this, a couple times at least, my response here was, well, look, that's exactly what people are obviously doing with God. They do choose him, and they choose to reject him sometimes. I mean, otherwise, what is it that we witness whenever we hear of people committing murder, or committing extortion, or committing abuse, or committing theft? Clearly, in that moment, they are choosing and rejecting God. So even if he's right, that God's not an omnipotent entity, or whatever, even if he's right about that, he's not right to say that God is not someone who could be rejected. And I'm kind of confused by what he says here, because later on he's going to say, yeah, I mean, we all sin and do bad things, right? So I don't know. I just don't understand why he's saying this. Again, DBH is very clear that God is a being who is in himself, quote, the fullness of being and the transcendental horizon of reality that animates every single stirring of reason and desire, the always more remote end present within every more immediate end, page 183, okay? Now, again, this is his conception of God, and again, I don't have too much of a problem with it. And I would agree that God is someone who makes possible my reasoning, and he makes possible my desiring. He makes possible my decisions. He is, after all, my creator. He is your creator. He's the creator of DBH and everybody. But I think DBH is saying something different here and he's going to conclude something different from this fact than what most of us are going to be comfortable with. Now, in the next quote that I'm going to read from him, you'll see his understanding of how freedom really works, and because he's going to state some things very explicitly. So I'm going to quote him at length here. It's a quote from page 183. He says, quote, "Insofar as we are able freely to will anything at all, therefore, it is precisely because he, God, is making us to do so, as at once the course of all action and intentionality in rational natures, and also the transcendental object of rational desire that elicits every act of mind and will toward any purpose whatsoever. God is not merely some external agency who would have to exercise coercion or external compulsion of a creature's intentions to bring them to the end he desires. God, in his omnipotence and omniscience, is wholly capable of determining the result of all secondary causes, including free will, while not acting as yet another discrete cause among them," unquote. Here's my response. I don't think this exactly works as it stands. There needs to be something more that I think DBH leaves out. Let me explain what the problem might be under DBH's construal here. If all of what DBH says is true, that is, if God is wholly capable of determining the result of all secondary causes, including free will, then why is there such a thing as evil? That age-old problem of evil seems to be a problem for him uniquely here. If God is truly capable of doing that, then, namely, if he's truly capable of determining the result of all secondary causes, God's capable of doing that, then is he causing evil? Because there's evil going on like right now. As you watch this video, someone's committing a heinous act of evil. Or is he simply just not stopping it, even though he's capable of stopping it, right? Now, I may be misunderstanding something here, so I'll stand corrected, of course, if I am misunderstanding him. But based on what I'm reading, I'm not so sure DBH is completely on track here. Now, I think he's slightly there, right? But not completely. Not in a way that he could be if he had a different understanding of human free will, I think. Lots more to be said here, but let me keep moving on. It seems to me that what he is missing is a concept of that self-determination with respect to creaturely freedom. He seems to be missing some sort of creaturely autonomy that seems necessary for what it means to be a creature, not least when it comes to committing evil acts. So to me, his particular view of freedom collapses divine and human agency, or at least it confuses them in a way that I'm not comfortable with. I know, of course, why he wants to construct his definition of freedom the way he does. I mean, he wants all people to be saved, and this is a way he gets there. And I know that he knows that God is love, and surely God desires that everyone be saved, just like you, I hope you desire everyone to be saved. But he has to pay a fairly big price for this view, one that I'm not so sure he has sufficiently considered in the pages of his book, at least, this book. Now that price that he pays, of course, is not just the sacrificing human freedom in the self-determining sense, but he's also sacrificing the capacity for genuine love. Now, you can't have genuine love without genuine choice, and I think for it to work satisfactorily, you'll need, I think, a different concept of freedom than what he gives. Now, of course, DBH is going to say, I believe in genuine love, but I'm not so sure his view allows him to have that consistently. Now, he thinks he's consistent, but I'm just not seeing it. I don't like how he's construing his definition of freedom. I just don't think it can sustain what he believes in, namely genuine freedom. Now, what's interesting is that DB actually thinks he can account for the problem of evil under his view, right? He says, for example, on page 186, that while God will eventually get what he wants in the end, namely the salvation of all, God may not always get what he wants in the meantime. So he says on page 186, this is worth quoting and you marking in your book. He says, as an infinite and transcendental end, God's goodness may be indeterminate as regards proximate ends, and that very indeterminacy may be what allows for deliberate determinations. There may be conflicts and confusion, mistakes and perversities in the great middle distance of life. Now, what I take him to creation or the fall of humanity and the final eschaton, or the end, when everybody's saved, in between that time, God's not always getting his way. There's going to be, quote, confusion, conflicts, mistakes, perversities in what he calls the great middle distance of life, right? So my response is, why is that the case? Now, this seems to me to be an easy way out of the problem of evil for him. And it's an easy way for him to just make sense of why people choose bad things, right? But it seems to me that even as he develops his elaborate system for why everyone in the end will inevitably choose the good, right here he wants to slip in some sort of conception of freedom that one might very wonder if he can actually do given the system that he's constructed. My question is just provisional here, but because I want to think more about this, but my question would just simply be, why slip this in? What is the value of allowing people who are, quote, in that great middle distance of life to have this sort of freedom? Let me elaborate just a wee bit more here. I suppose he would say, well, because it is a good thing for people to have this sort of freedom. The freedom to choose to love, the freedom to choose to love in this great middle distance of life. I think that's why he's going to say, yeah, you need freedom of some sort, and of course, Gregory of Nyssa is going to say that freedom is a great good. So anyway, of course, the freedom to choose to love is also at the same time a freedom to choose not to love. Now that follows. And it is quite apparent that many people in this present life choose this option of not loving God or not loving people. So So, I mean, obviously right now, during this time, never mind the end of time, right now, some people are choosing not to love God and some people are choosing to love God. And some people have, at least according to what I've just read about DBH, some people have freedom. Like God's not actively causing every little division, every little act that we perform now in the present time. I mean, DBH doesn't think, on my reading at least, that God's causing every little thing that all of his creatures do. I mean, God's not causing murder, or he's not causing someone to commit murder, for example. He says, right now people are choosing their own thing. And why is that? Well, I'm assuming that DBH is a good disciple of Gregory of Nyssa. He's going to say, well, hey, look, freedom is a great good. That's why we have it right now, right? So, okay. Well, let's talk about this. I mean, is that fair for him just to slip in right now, or is that consistent with him just to slip in right now? He kind of does it unawares, right? Kind of in the seams of his argument, he kind of just throws it in there. Well, let's talk about a little bit about freedom. As one scholar has said, there are a couple of things we need to keep in mind about freedom. First, the degree to which a person can choose to love must necessarily be the degree to which they are able to choose not to love. Okay? So how much do you want a person to love? Well, okay, say 100 widgets of love. That's how much you want a person to be able to love. And you're going to grant that person that much freedom. Well, if you're going to grant them that much freedom to love by 100 widgets, then necessarily you're granting them 100 widgets of freedom to not love if they so choose, right? So there's that sort of relationship between that. So if that's the case, then this conception of freedom would be and must be, by definition, a determining act, one that is consequential. It has to have consequences to be free. So if you give someone a freedom to choose, but you take away the consequences of their choices all the time, well then, guess what? They're not free, right? So I suspect that even DBH would agree to this, okay, in some sense. I think he would agree to this conception of freedom in this great middle distance of life, this time between the fall of humanity, or the creation of humanity, and the eschaton, when all people get saved. Yeah, that sort of freedom is what we have, obviously, right? Well, this time period, you're seeing a lot of consequences to people's actions, right? You're seeing people make really bad choices that have really bad consequences. And of course, I'm thinking of decisions like the ones to create places like Auschwitz, right? Concentration camps. Well, this it seems to me to be a conception of freedom that makes sense of the world that we live in. So I think DBH is right here. I think we do have freedom in this great middle section of life, right? And it is the only conception of freedom that makes sense of all evils that we see in our lifetime that come upon our world. And this conception of freedom maintains a sufficient distance, or a sufficient difference between God's agency and human agency, between God's acts and human acts, in such a way that does not confuse the two. So that absolves God from any possible accusation that he is the cause of evil. Because why? Well, because you have genuine creaturely freedom. Right now, you have people who have freedom such that they can determine for themselves how they're going to conduct their lives right now in the present time, and so forth and so on. And so when you grant this sort of libertarian-esque type freedom to people, then that really does a good job in providing sufficient distance between the agencies of God and the agency of man. Okay, and that absolves God of the charge of being the author of evil. Okay, now I suspect that this idea is not incoherent. I don't think it is incoherent at all with respect to the present life. With respect, that is, to the present rebellion that you and I see going on in the world right now. Right now, people are disobeying the Lord. And it seems that DBH might agree with this with respect to the present time, right? But here's the deal. Whether he does or not, here's the deal. If the free will defense for evil acts and a person's culpability and punishment for those evil acts is sufficient in the present time, I suspect it would also be sufficient for every subsequent present moment too. That is, it is sufficient for some sort of eternal punishment. If the free will defense makes sense of all the evil that we see in the world going on today, which it does, I think, then it would also seem to make sense of any subsequent evil that takes place at the end of time in a place called, say, hell. Now, I've said that, it seems like, repeatedly over and over, but I hope my point comes across here. Now, here's what I want to do. I do want to thank DBH for pressing this issue as much as he has. I don't think he's, quite honestly, I don't think he's as appreciated as much as I think he should be. Now, while I don't think his version of freedom works for the most part, and while I don't think that everyone will end up being saved in the end, and I say this, of course, with sadness, I do think that he is right to push us to consider what Gregory of Nyssa urges to consider all along, namely that one day God would be all in all. What does that mean? What does that look like? Well, I think, therefore, that if God will truly be all in all, and if universalism is not true, and if God will truly be all in all, then we need to reconsider what hell is like. We need to reconsider how we conceive hell. Whatever hell is, it will need to be understood as a different sort of existence. Now, in a few weeks, we're going to cover that when I discuss one scholar's proposal about what hell's like and so forth. And that proposal is very consistent with a libertarian-esque type of a version of free will. And I think it's going to work way better than DBH's conception of freedom that he gives, right? Before we get into all that, though, I do want to make a switch. I want us to focus our attention from here on out on C.S. Lewis and his conception of heaven and hell and so forth. We're going to obviously look at his book, The Great Divorce, because in that book I think he makes some really good points about heaven, about hell, and about the love of God that I think are worth considering. So, in other words, what I hope to try to do is to take C.S. Lewis, even though I don't think his views are absolutely perfect, right? I think there are some nuggets of truth in his views that I think are definitely worthy of consideration.